Hello. These are the readings, a little commentary, and somewhat of a homily for the seventh Sunday of the year, this year that is February 24th, 2019. First reading is that one where David does something that's almost inexplicable, and it's from 1 Samuel. In those days, Saul went down to the desert of Ziph with 3,000 picked men of Israel to search for David in the desert of Ziph. So David and Abishai went among Saul's soldiers by night and found Saul lying asleep within the barricade, with his spear thrust into the ground at his head, and Abner and his men sleeping around him. Abishai whispered to David, "God has delivered your enemy into your grasp this day. Let me nail him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I will not need a second thrust." But David said to Abishai, "Do not harm him, for who can lay hands on Yahweh's anointed and remain unpunished?" So David took the spear and the water jug from their place at Saul's head, and they got away without anyone seeing or knowing or awakening. All remained asleep, because Yahweh had put them into a deep slumber. Going across to an opposite slope, David stood on a remote hill, at a great distance from Abner son of Ner and the troops. He said, "Here is the king's spear. Let an attendant come over to get it. Yahweh will reward each man for his justice and faithfulness. Today, though Yahweh delivered you into my grasp, I would not harm Yahweh's anointed." The second reading is from 1 Corinthians. We're still in that famous chapter 15 that deals with the resurrection of Jesus. Brothers and sisters, it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit. But the spiritual was not first, rather the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, earthly. The second man from heaven. As was the earthly one, so also are the earthly. And as is the heavenly one, so also are the heavenly. Just as we have borne the image of the earthly one, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly one. The word of the Lord. And the gospel is again from that famous chapter 6 of Luke, his Sermon on the Plain, his section that parallels Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said to his disciples, "To you who hear, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If to the person who strikes you on one cheek, offer the other as well. And from the person who takes your cloak, do not withhold even your tunic. Give to everyone who asks of you, and from the one who takes what is yours, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. For if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do the same. If you lend money to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But rather love your enemies and do good to them. Lend expecting nothing back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he himself is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Stop judging, and you will not be judged. Stop condemning, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and gifts will be given to you. A good measure, packed together, shaken down, and overflowing, will be poured into your lap. For the measure with which you measure will in turn be measured out to you. The Gospel of the Lord. One of the most misunderstood words in Scripture is the word that we normally translate holy. It would be kadosh, for instance, in the Hebrew scriptures. And it really doesn't mean holy or pious or someone whose eyes are always looking up to heaven, making sure they're in contact with God. Holy is a very simple word and not necessarily defined correctly. Holy is just a one-word adjective. It means other, O-T-H-E-R. It means you are other than people around you, or you do something different from what people around you would do. Holy simply implies you are not like everybody else. This carries over, for instance. I remember years ago seeing the movie Jeremiah Johnson with Robert Redford. And in there is a scene in which a pioneer family is wiped out by Native Americans. And the poor mother who survives obviously has suffered a nervous breakdown. And at one point, Jeremiah Johnson tries to convince her to come along with him and the one surviving son. And then he begins to think and says, no, I can leave you here. The Indians aren't going to hurt you because you're tetched. And by tetched he meant you're basically insane. And Indians regard insane people as close to their gods, so they never hurt him. In a way, an insane person, according to Jeremiah Johnson, is holy. That's why the Native Americans will not hurt them. But it is important to understand that holiness and that otherness, especially in today's three readings. David does something that's holy. It's other. Everybody around him said, you should kill that guy. You finally got Saul, the guy who's trying to kill you, and you're trying to overthrow anyway as king of Israel. You finally got him in a position where he's dead, and you let him survive. Did the same thing a couple chapters before, remember, when Saul goes into this cave to relieve himself, not realizing David is hiding in that cave. And David could easily kill him. As a matter of fact, he reaches over while Saul's doing his thing and cuts off a piece of his cloak, and then does something similar to what he does here with the water jug. He basically waits till Saul gets out of range and then says, are you missing a piece of your cloak? Saul holds it up and says, if I was close enough to cut off this piece of your cloak, I was close enough to kill you. Now, the author of Samuel is very pro-monarchical. He thinks they need a monarchy, and the monarch is obviously the one who Yahweh sends to help people. And that's why David doesn't do anything to hurt Saul, even though at this stage Saul's not really a very good person. But the image here is David does something counter to what other people would do. That means you're dealing with a very holy individual. David is other than people around him. And that's what we are called to be as Christians. Paul says that in that 1 Corinthians 15 passage by referring to Jesus as the second man. He's not the first man, not like Adam. He's different. And if we follow Jesus, then we're called also to be different. It's not easy to be different. If you're like I am, I most of the time simply enjoy blending in with the crowd. I don't like to be distinctive. I remember one night as a student in Rome, I was eating in a restaurant and started to choke on a piece of apple. And it really was wedged in my windpipe. I couldn't breathe. And the man next to me had tried out for the Olympic wrestling team. He was a rather hefty guy. And he started pounding me on my back. And no luck, it wouldn't come out. And finally, when I'm starting to turn different colors, he says, Roger, throw your hands up in the air, straight over your head. And I looked at him like, what are you doing that for? And he says, well, maybe it'll loosen your throat muscles and you can cough up the piece of apple. And I hesitated, because if I threw my hands up in the air like that in this restaurant, people would look at me. That's why that famous Jack Benny routine where somebody puts a gun in his ribs in a dark alley one night and says, "Your money or your life." And there's this pause, and the robber says again, "I said," and Jack Benny says, "I heard you the first time. I'm thinking it over." Well, I thought it over that night. I was pretty certain I was about to die, to choke to death, and I thought it over. Simply because if I threw my hands in the air, people around me would look at me. I would be odd throwing my hands up in the air. I eventually did, and the piece of apple I could cough up, only because I figured they'd stare at me more if they took my body out on a stretcher. But I was almost willing to die in order not to be holy, in order not to be different. That's why the Sermon on the Plain, part of it at least, that comprises today's gospel, is so important, because Jesus is basically telling his people, be holy, be different. Don't worry if people stare at you or talk about you. You should be doing the opposite of what people around you think is important or think that they should be doing. And if you do that, you're certainly going to stand out. You're not going to stand out because of the clothes you wear. You're not going to be a standout individual because you're holy and pious. You're going to stand out because what you do is unexpected. What you do is something that most people are never tempted to do. And he goes through the list of things that we have all sorts of difficulty with. For instance, if you lend people money, just give it to them. No matter who asked of you, just give it. Don't ask for a return to it. Somebody slugs you on one side of the face, don't retaliate. Simply turn the other side of the face and offer that to the individual. All the way through the line of these various actions, you are called upon to be other. We're called upon to be different. Or, in their terminology, we're called upon to be holy. No matter what that costs us, no matter how we stand out sometimes in a crowd of people. I always go back to the end of the 1989 Indianapolis 500. I was watching it on television, and Al Unser was leading the race 2 laps from the end over Emerson Fittipaldi, and Fittipaldi basically spun Unser out. Everybody agreed he really did that deliberately to get Unser out of his way. And Unser spun up against the fence, got out of his car, took off all of his restraints and everything, and stood on the pit apron, or not the pit apron, the track apron, waiting for Fittipaldi to come by. He had to come by one more time to get the checkered flag. And everybody's anticipating what kind of sign or what kind of signal Unser is going to give Fittipaldi for costing him the most prestigious race in the world. And to everybody's surprise, when Fittipaldi comes around the corner, Unser gives him a thumbs up like this. He doesn't give him any other hand signal. And everybody's wondering what was behind the thumbs up. That was totally unexpected. And when the reporters got to Unser, he says, well, when I was getting off of those restraints, people around me said, boy, I bet you're going to give it to him when he comes around here, aren't you? And it dawned on me, everybody was expecting me to do those rather vile signs toward Fittipaldi. He said, if I did that, nobody would remember what I did. If I did the opposite, not only would everybody remember it, it would make all the highlight reels. And he was right. Whenever there is a highlight reel of the 1989 Indianapolis 500, Unser's thumbs up signal to Fittipaldi is always front and center. That's why I think sometimes Jesus looked at us and said, you don't have to be a Christian just because you say so. You don't have to be a Christian only because you can rattle off all the laws and regulations of the church. You be a Christian because people look at you and say, you're different. You don't do what other people do. You might actually be in a category of Jesus of Nazareth. He did not do what people expected. Of course, my fear would be in that restaurant that night in Rome, I'd have to be exceptional and people would stare at me, which would cause me some pain. I think always being holy, always being different, in the same imitation of Jesus that he asks all of us to do, will cause us pain. It will not just cost us the pain of getting slugged on the other side of the cheek. It'll cost us sometimes simply in a category that people will look at us and say, they're weird. And I always remember years ago when I first started teaching at Modern Day High School back in '67, I guess it was, I had a class of junior boys, people who had basically been in Catholic education at that stage for 11 years. And I was a little suspicious of how much they knew about Jesus of Nazareth. So one day I came into the room, paraphrased part of this Sermon on the Plain or Sermon on the Mount, I can't remember which one I paraphrased, and asked them two questions. Who said this? And then the second question was, what do you think about what he or she said? Not one student, probably about 30 boys in that room, knew that Jesus of Nazareth had said these things. But eventually one kid held up his hand and says, oh, I don't know who said it, but he sure in the heck must have been crazy. I hate to tell him, but he would have agreed with Robert Redford. Obviously, Jesus was holy. That's why he said those things. That's why he did those things. And I suspect many of us would much rather prefer looking up to heaven with our eyes nicely concentrating on some vision or something like that, than simply every day of our life do things that other people will look at us and say, why did you do that? That doesn't make any sense. I hate to tell you, as I ended the commentary this week, the written commentary, I simply said it would be very nice if our actions made the highlight reel of what Jesus really asked his people to be involved in. Thank you.